Well, I'm streaming. I'm not quite sure I'm recording because it says I have to upgrade if I record. Oh, is it recording? Okay. Well, let us trust in that. As I sent out an email with a link, Andrew has been working very hard along with Jenny Wu. No. Is it Wu?
It's Wu.
It's Wu. Yeah, Jenny
Well, you
Wu.
know, my husband, his last name is Wu, so.
Oh. I hear so much in that comment. I'll disregard. And Hanran and Minister Chris have worked very hard. And so I believe you're able to access this through our YouTube channel at our church. And so we're grateful for that. Let's see, it should be, as I've mentioned earlier in the pulpit, we are looking at the second half. The women's role within family and women's role in church are kind of linked in such a way that if you hold one type of position for one of those areas, it automatically bleeds into the other. And so while I was doing the studies for the passage, women in leadership kept popping up. And that's an issue that I felt like should be addressed. And obviously couldn't do it in a sermon. So we're going to take a look at it today. Once again, I'm assuming there are people on both sides of this particular issue and passionately on both sides of the issue. But hopefully as I go through this, you'll get some data that may help you in developing your own thought and position. A lot of the material here comes from the egalitarian side, women in leadership side, partly because I grew up simply assuming that all pastors are men, all preaching should be done by men, all elders should be male. And I've heard all the arguments, or most of the arguments, all throughout my life. My assumption is that most of the evangelical church do not get to hear the other side as much. And so I'm presenting the other side, while hopefully the complementary side, those who believe that men leading, women following, complement each other. That will be part of the discussion as well. But once again, until I'm done, if you can reserve judgment and we can have discussion afterwards. I doubt we'll resolve any heated issues today, but at least we hopefully will gain a perspective. But women in the church is a huge issue these days. So I only have 2 points. There's more evidence for women in leadership than we may think. So obviously it's dotted because there's a second half. But I find it interesting that I wasn't made aware through my spiritual journey of some of the evidence that is there for women in leadership. And there's far more than I would have thought, and maybe some of you. So I want to go through those a good bit. Yeah. So, yeah, something. Oh, that's bad. I'm not sure how to take care of that issue. Camera? Where?
Right here, do we have to turn that off?
Oh. Yeah. Oh no. Oh no. Okay. Are they seeing the slides now? No.
Because the camera only shows you. Are you presenting?
Is it?
Oh,
Maybe not share. Maybe just
Yeah,
share.
share.
It should be a share screen.
Oh, do that. Yeah.
You have to share
Yeah,
this.
there you go.
Now it's working?
Yeah.
You know,
It's still.
yeah, now I go to, there's so many directions. It's working, so, right.
Yes.
Now we are working. You know, it's wonderful to be in a church that's Chinese with so many STEM people. The beauty of being here as part of. Some evidence is hidden by some of the English translations we use. Now, this may be a little bit controversial in that when you read the English text, it's gone through translation, and all translations have an interpretive element built in. It's impossible to go from Greek to English without interpretation because it's not transliteration. It's translation, right? Transliteration is symbol to symbol. Translation is meaning to meaning, and that's going to pick up an interpretive element. So I don't want to knock anyone's socks off, but the English translations you have are wonderful. It's the Word of God. But there are translation differences between versions, as we saw from ESV and NIV today, and which you will continue to see today, because ESV has a particular taint to their translation. NIV has a different taint. So who is this woman, this person? I put person because there's debate as to whether she's a woman or a man. It's Junia or Junius, depending upon whether she's seen as male or female. And she's found at the end of Romans chapter 16, where Paul is greeting a number of people at the end of his letter. I think it's verse 7 if you're looking it up, but it's also in the presentation. So if we look here, she could be understood as a male, greet Andronicus and Junius. See the S at the end, the masculine. And my kinsman and fellow prisoner, they are men. See, that's RSV wants to make sure they are men of note among the apostles, and they were in Christ before me. Or she could be interpreted as female, Andronicus and Junia, that's the female, my kinsman and fellow, all the way down, and that's ESV, NIV, NASB. Now, these days, all modern translations, or most modern translations, take the person as female, not male. Now, this was a huge issue because Junia is either well known to the apostle, or the other translation was prominent among the apostles. So see the difference here? So ESV, they're well known to the apostles. So you a woman who's leading in the church and serving in the church in a way that she's well known to the apostles, her reputation precedes her, but no official title is given. That's ESV translation. But if you look at the NIV, here this translation, they are outstanding or prominent among the apostles. Now, if you go with the first, she's just a very helpful, strong leader, but no official title. If you go with the second, she's labeled as an apostle. It depends upon which translation. So if you're going with the ESV and you're reading through, you're thinking, well, this has nothing to do with women in leadership. But if you're reading here, you're thinking, oh man, is there a woman who's identified as an apostle? Which raises more questions, but at least you're aware that it's raising questions. Okay. So is she a faithful servant the apostles knew well? Or is she a prominent apostle, an apostle herself? So that's the second. Is she male or female? And then is she an apostle or she's just well known? So two questions arise, and I left it in the Greek so that we're not falling into either one of those. But there are two questions. So how can the same Greek phrase be understood so differently? I mean, two very different meanings. And secondly, how should we, or safely which do I prefer? So we're going to go with the second and then work with the first. So my apologies, but this is probably the most technical part of the study. But I'm doing this so that hopefully you get a sense, at least in one of the issues, because the other issues I can't go so deep. We don't have enough time. But at least one issue we're going to go deep so that you can see the choices that are made by the translator. And different translators make different choices. Just like Paige Patterson would not preach the sermon I preached this morning in the same way. In fact, he criticizes the evangelical church for teaching submission, but not leaving it out in the home. And what I did was teach submission, but I vacated it by replacing it with a healthy marriage. To me, I feel convicted in that way, but he and I would disagree, even though we're in the same theological position and preaching from the same Bible. So how should we translate this phrase? They're well known, which is exclusive. She's going to be excluded from the group of apostles, or inclusive. She's included. So you have the two choices that are here, so that when we look at the NIV's inclusive, virtually all of the native-speaking early church held to an inclusive view. So now we're going to look at not just how modern translators look at it, but how did the early church, so that we don't read our modern biases into the interpretive process, but we want to include generations earlier. All native Greek speaking, that's Greek Orthodox Church, held to an inclusive view. I mean, the vast majority, I could almost say it's unanimous, held on to an inclusive view. So that's Junia on the right, and then Andronicus on the left, and you can picture with Athanasius was one of the huge scholars of the early church, Greek Orthodox, but she's icon as a woman and as an apostle, and that was not debated in that particular realm of the church where Greek was their native tongue. And then John Chrysostom, as an early preacher, to be an apostle is something great, but to be outstanding among the apostles, just think what a wonderful song of praise that is. They were outstanding on the basis of their works and virtuous actions. Indeed, how great the wisdom of this woman must have been that she was even deemed worthy of the title of apostle. But even here, he does not stop, but adds another song of praise besides. You who were also in Christ before me. In other words, she got saved before Paul got saved. And she's very well known among the apostles. So now, early Greek church, Orthodox church, this is a very standard interpretation. Now, I'm getting the next few slides from an article that's written from Andrews University. So you have here John Damascus noted Junia to be called an apostle is a great thing. So you have another individual, early church on the Greek side. And then Eason points out, Junia is honored to this day as an apostle, even within that church, together with 56 male apostles and 2 who are like apostles. Mary Magdalene, because she was commissioned by Jesus to go tell the other apostles that he has risen from the dead. So many think that she has that element of authoritative. And then Keener, oh boy, it is also unnatural to read a text that's merely claiming that a high reputation with apostles, so he's rejecting the ESV, since they were in prison with him. Paul knows them well enough to recommend them without appealing to the other apostles, whose judgment he never cites on such matters. Paul nowhere limits the apostolic company of the 12 just to himself, or plus himself. In other words, the word apostle doesn't apply just to the 12 male apostles in the Gospels. It's used further out, as some have assumed. Those who favor the view that Junia is not a female apostle do so because they're prior that women could not be apostles. In other words, they're letting their bias get in the way of the translation process, not because of any evidence from the text. When the text is translated straightforward, it should read that she is an apostle, but in his opinion, there's pushback because you don't want a woman to be an apostle in some circles. Richard Buckham is a leading New Testament scholar, someone who I respect and worked with in reading some of his books. Writers such as Origen, Chrysostom were educated native speakers. They had no reason for thinking Andronicus and Junia to be apostle other than supporting this to be Paul's meaning in Greek. This is Paul's Greek and how he speaks. So that's one. The second is a normal translation of this kind of phrase is inclusive. Now, when I say normal, that's really, I should put quotes in there because there's no such thing as a normal translation per se, right? All translation is contextualized by the text. But when I do look at a transliteration, so this is the Greek phrase right here. When I look at a transliteration, not transliteration, but they're giving you the translation of the words apart from its meaning within the phrase. It's in and is usually among, which is inclusive. That's the normal way this Greek preposition works, or in usual cases. So here are some illustrations. Matthew 2:6. O Bethlehem, you are least among the rulers of Judah. So that's inclusive, and you got the N right there. And then Acts 3:4, a needy person among them. Once again, inclusive, and you have the N there. And the dative there is plural, so that's important. It's plural, not singular. And then 1 Peter 5, the elders among you, once again, inclusive. So that generally or normally it's translated inclusive. The standard reading of this text was inclusive until the identity of this person was affirmed as being female. So if you see Junius, the person as being male, then you could have prominent among the apostles as the reading. But when it was recognized that it's better to translate her as being female, the new interpretive in view of the apostles emerged. In fact, that side will admit that it did not emerge until about the 1940s and 50s. Prior to that, it was rarely, if ever, translated that way. So if you control one or the two, male, female, and then that phrase, it all depends upon which one you want to work with in order to exclude female as having an official title of apostle. Oh, wait a minute. I'm going to have to come back to that. Sorry. And then here, just from the, I think it's different article or same article. Junius is, of course, a Roman name, and in that case, the two would probably be husband and wife. Junius, on the other hand, is less usual as a man's name, if, as is probable, Andronicus and Junius are included among apostles. That is more, then it is more probable that the name is masculine. In other words, Junia, so in the modern translations, they're shifting back to a female name because the male name is seen as a contraction of a larger name, but there's no evidence for that contraction whereby it should be Junius. And so what he's saying is it should be female, and then the way you see it as masculine or feminine will determine how you interpret that crucial phrase as being inclusive or disclusive. The conflicting interpretations continue to this day, as we see in the ESV and NIV. The textual commentary to the USB Greek text, that's the main Greek text that we work off of when you're learning Greek in seminary, noted some members of the USB committee considering it unlikely that a woman would be among those stout apostles understood the name to be masculine, even though there's no real historical evidence for that. It's the theological bias that moves it that way. And it's not wrong, because we believe that the Bible is written by a number of different authors, but there's only one author behind it. So if you see one text that's clear to you that women cannot be apostles or pastors or whatever, then you want to translate the other sections in a way consistent without ripping the Greek apart. So the question here is the Greek being mangled or not? Let me keep going. Now here's one. This has got questions. So when you Google this, what you get here is the Greek language construction is not 100% definitive, but strongly leans in favor of translating the verse as the ESV does. Greet Andronicus and Junia, my kinsmen. They're well known to it. I find this highly interesting because that's a modern, since the 1950s. But for this writer, it's not 100% definitive, but strongly leans. Actually, it goes the reverse. So I'm pointing this out because, most lay people, when they get information, they Google and they read through the website. And when they do, they get, wow, it strongly leans. And ESV is the newer translation than the NIV. And we have this newer, the better mentality in our culture. But yet, I don't know if any scholar would say it strongly leans in that direction. I think at best you can say the ESV is a possible reading, but not the stronger reading. And I'll show that as we move forward. Because I want to look at three major commentaries. So if I taught Romans 3 semesters at Moody. The standard commentaries you start off with is the Word, the Baker, and the Moose NIC. So there are three commentaries. So I looked up those three. And when you look up those three, so that's Junius, the masculine, it's a contraction. And these had gone with it in earlier stages, but the simple masculine form has been found nowhere else. And the name is more naturally taken as female. And the list of 250 illustrations of that. as was taken for granted by the patristic commentators, indeed, up to the Middle Ages. The assumption that it must be male is a striking indictment of male presumption, recording the character and structure of the earliest church. So definitely female here too. And so Doug Moo was the PhD director at Trinity when I was there, and then he moved over to Wheaton as the PhD director there. The woman name is Junia. Interpreters between the 13th to the middle of the 20th century favored masculine, but before the 13th it was female. But it appears that commentators before the 13th century were unanimous in favor of different identification, and scholars have recently again inclined decisively to that same view. That's why the old has the masculine, the new NIV has the feminine, and probably for good reason. For while contracted form of Junius would quite fit well into this list of greetings, we want male apostles, we have no evidence anywhere else for this contraction of this particular name. And then he goes on. Now, this is the two clauses. Is it inclusive or exclusive? In two relative clauses, Paul draws the attention of the Roman Christians to the stature of this husband and wife ministry team. The first description might mean that Andronicus and Junia were esteemed by the apostles. That's the ESV. It's possible, but it is more natural to translate esteemed among the apostles. And it is because Paul called Junius an apostle that early interpreters tend to ignore that Paul must be referring to a male once again. But the natural translation is that it is to be inclusive. And then this is Baker. Baker and Schreiner is a professor at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. How should we understand the phrase inclusive or exclusive? Murray is virtually alone among modern commentators in understanding it as outstanding in the eyes of the apostles. So that exclusive view is an extreme minority position. The consensus view is that the phrase means distinguished among the apostles. The latter is almost surely right, for this is a more natural understanding of the prepositional phrase. So that if you got that phrase on a Greek exam, you would make it inclusive, and that will be correct. Then why go exclusive? Well, a number of these writers think it is because of the biasness that's attached to it. Let me give you one more illustration. It's real quick. Phoebe, is she a servant or is she a deacon? See, I commend to your sister Phoebe, a servant. See the A there, this ESV. See the footnote A? If you go down, it's deacon. Because it's the same word. It's I can't even say it. It's the same word, and it can be translated as servant or deacon, and it's deacon as in 1 Timothy chapter 2. So it depends upon how you translate it. So ESV decided to put servant up front, but how many of you look at footnotes when you read the Bible? If you flip it, you could just say Phoebe a deacon and then footnote the word servant on the bottom, because it's the same word when used of male deacons as well here. So that if you look at the ESV, you get servant. If you get the NIV, you get deacon. Now, do you see a pattern here? NIV seems far more friendly into certain camps and ESV not. Do you know why? NIV decided to put out an inclusive language Bible so that God is, and the male language is not predominant, but more inclusive. Like not men are, but they are, right? So, and ESV thought that that was a departure from the original text. So Wayne Grudem, John Piper, and a couple others decided to come and counter the NIV by sponsoring a translation that was more complementarian in nature. In other words, there was a theological bias that is at work. That's not saying they're wrong. It's just that there was a theological bias to create a translation that would offset the NIV's more inclusive language, female leadership friendly translation. All translations have some type of philosophy that's behind it. So Paul uses dikaionos to describe his own ministry, same word, but it's unlikely that this parallel could ever be gleaned from English translations alone. So one writer says, if you really want to study this, you got to study the Greek. Who has time to study the Greek? But if you look at the books that are written in the footnotes and really investigate the issues, more options open up to you than what you actually read black and white on the text. Hang on, let me go. So some passages restricting women in ministry may say more than we want. There's standard 3 passages that people go to restrict women's ministry. We're going to look at the 3. We're not going to try to get the meaning of the 3. But what I'll show is that if you take it as it is written, it says a lot more than you'll be comfortable with. So here's one. As in all the churches, saying that women should keep silent in the church. Have you read this passage? Have you asked, what does it mean? Because if I took it face value just from this verses, our church would be extremely quiet. Meal times would be like funeral dirges. And I could be home by 1:30 rather than waiting for my wife to keep talking to everyone until 3 o'clock. It's not literally, is it literally silent? Is it in churches or is it in particular times where they're not permitted to speak but should be in submission? As the law also says, if there's among they desire to learn, let them ask their husbands at home. Oh man! For it is shameful for a woman to speak in the church. This is one of the primary passages used for women not being in teaching roles, but when they push that, they need to explain here, and it's extremely difficult. In fact, I would say impossible without violating other areas of your theology. It's saying far more than you wanted to say. So here are all of the interpretive possibilities from the various. So women cannot be leaders in a worship service. College Park, where my daughter, when she went to Wheaton, she served as a secretary there. You cannot have women song leaders. You cannot have women in the praise band. Nothing up front. Women cannot pray. That's one. Only in official congregational meetings. Now, I put in the word congregational, but it's official meetings within the church. So it's outside the worship context, but any official meeting, women should not act. They have an issue, you don't say it. Because you're shaming your husband by things you say. So you go home and ask the husband. In teaching situations, including, why are they looking at you?
Does that include singles then?
So here's the thing. The word for male, female is the same word for husband, wife. So there's a huge issue as whether all men are husband and wife. Because there's only 2 possibilities. When you get Andre, it's either man or husband. So you have to decide. And that creates another whole category. Right? But in this view, if you're single, you ought to get married anyway, right? I'm just kidding. You know. In teaching situations, even to ask questions, I will be here today as participants in worship service, even by singing. So we had one guy. And this guy was the 16th century, so don't take him too seriously. But he argued that women could not sing. You know, when Luther started the hymns in the churches, women shouldn't sing in the worship service at all. Textual corruption, so we will never know. Gordon Fee argues that the Greek manuscripts got so mangled that we'll never know them. You can't really translate it in a way that you would use it for any church policy or theological construction. In tongues, which is reserved only for men. So remember 1 Corinthians 14, the whole bit on tongues. So women should not speak in tongues, but men should speak in tongues. So it's reserved that way. A Corinthian belief, which Paul's rebutting. So that this statement that was just read, Paul did not write that to reflect his view. He was writing about how feminist-driven worshipers of Artemis in Ephesus, who became Christians, brought with them this strong feminism, and Paul is citing what they're saying in order to counter it and undermine it. He does that in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. The body is made for food. So he's not saying that's my view. He's quoting from the Corinthians and their view. So you got that. It's a non-Pauline interpretation interpolation. So that's not Paul's view, but some manuscript writer added it in way earlier in the process and got embedded it in the text, just like 1 John chapter 5, verse 7, the three are one. Remember, the Trinitarian phrase doesn't belong in any manuscript prior to the 15th or 16th century, so it's interpolation. And then womanly chatter in worship service. So that now the construction is that women were gathering in the worship service, they're worshiping at home, and they haven't met all week, and so they keep talking to each other while the preacher is trying to speak. So when he says be silent, he means womanly chatter in worship service. I can safely say without a doubt, none of those views are majority held. Everyone is trying to find an explanation if you take this as being applied to women in some strong sense. And so what we do with this passage, it belongs in the Bible, it's the Word of God. We just don't think about it, talk about it, nor apply it. Extremely difficult to apply. The problem is in chapter 11, verse 5, Paul says, every woman or wife who prays or prophesies. He seems to indicate that talking is okay in the church. And in fact, in a way, prayer, this is public, not private, and then prophesy. So that it's hard to cohere 1 Corinthians 11 and 1 Corinthians 14. And then 1 Corinthians 11 has its own problems, right? Uncovered dishonors her head. And what does that mean? And how do you apply that? And then women should wear head coverings when speaking. How do we understand that as well? And so the second passage is 1 Corinthians 11. So if you want to, 1 Corinthians, there's this passage, wait a minute. Yeah, so a woman who prays or prophets with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is the same as if her head were shaven, which would be shameful and dishonorable for her. So that here, this would be dishonorable to God. Dishonorable to God, if you take that passage in somewhat literal fashion. But now look at verse 11. The issue here is this phrase. For a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. That's a very difficult phrase to interpret in the light of the fact that Romans 1 indicates male and female are both in the image of God, and image and glory being synonyms. And for man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. That's, I don't know. If you take this straightforward as it says, it creates this second-class citizenship within Christianity, which can become quite abusive. So that if you use 1 Corinthians 11 as one of your primary passages for limiting or restricting women in leadership, just be careful. It may say a lot more than you wanted it to say. Are men and women equal in God's eyes? Remember the complementarian view, ego and personhood, subordination and role, but these passages seems to indicate subordination in being, the very nature of who they are. And then you have because of the angels. Now that's a fun one. Why do women have to cover their heads? Because of the angels? Is it because they're tempted sexually, which is one view? Or is it because they would be shamed to see a woman uncovered in her head? Either way, you have, or the third option is angels can also be translated messengers. So these are people that are bringing the letter to the church. And when they walk into the church and they see all these women with the uncovered heads, the messengers that bring the letter would be filled with shame. They're shocked. A number of issues arise. Did the church ever mandate covering of women's head in any period of church history on a broad level? Certain denominations here and there, but not on a broad level, has not been required. And even looking in this room, it has not been required. So take a look down here. Even though men are not present at these all-female assemblies, see, do you see what the female assemblies, what they're doing? They're saying we're going to resolve this issue by allowing 1 Corinthians 11, prophecy and prayer, only occurring in female assemblies and not in mixed assemblies. See, that's how they're resolving the tension between the two. The only problem is there's no historical evidence I'm aware of that there were all female assemblies or official gatherings in the early house church. But this is an attempt to try to resolve this issue. So this type of Bible study is wrong. Women screw together, that would be a violation, but instead wear hats is the only picture I could find of Bible. So cover your heads. And then lastly, and this is one of the famous Paxton's third, women should learn submissively. I do not permit a woman to teach. Adam was formed first, then Eve. Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived. So this is one of the primary texts that you would go to, and there's a debate as to whether this is universally applied to the church or only to the church in Ephesus, where they were struggling with strong, dominant women. But either way, but the woman was deceived. Now, we know that's Eve, but it doesn't say Eve, it says woman. So does this mean that all women are more deceivable than men? And so you see these commentators trying to work around it without offending half the Christian population. How do you interpret that? But if it's all nature, then what you have is an assumption that nature is somehow less than men when it comes to certain issues like theology, preaching, serving. And I put this in here because it's one of my more favorite stories. But before the 1960, actually it's 1971 or 72, officially you could not run as a woman in a Boston Marathon. And this is Katrin Schweitzer who applied. But she applied when women are not allowed to, but she put in her initial KV Schweitzer, and they included her thinking she was a man. And the reason why women were not allowed to run the marathons before was because they thought their bodies were too frail to make 26 miles. Now, did that come out of observation or standard assumption about the female nature? I can tell you, women can run 26.2 miles. I saw a lot of them pass me by as I was running the marathon. So she ran, when she started running the race, the race organizers realized what happened. So this is one of the race officials trying to pull her out. And the problem was that her friend, who was a 235-pound All-American football player and nationally hammer thrower named Big Tom Miller, ran with her and decided to get in the middle and take care of the issue. So she was able to finish. She was able to finish the race. And in fact, this is Mae Berman, who won the Boston Marathon female 3 times, and they made it official in 1972 to include women. What I'm saying is it's extremely, you should be extremely wise attributing any type of characteristic to the entire female gender, nor to the male. Women first allowed into college in 1831 in the United States. Why? Because studying was so pressure-filled and women are not built that way that if they went through college, their brains would blow up. There's just too much information. Rousseau, the search for abstract and speculative, not practical things, but speculative, philosophical, for principles and axioms in science, for all that tends to wide generalization is beyond a woman's grasp. Their studies should be thoroughly practical, not abstract. So that women are happiest when they're home. Old-fashioned housewives in the 1950s. And this role was connected to their nature. They are happiest at home because the nature of their femaleness allows her to flourish in the home, cooking, cleaning, and doing other things. There's a sermon by John Gregg. We have features peculiar to us as men, and we also have a peculiar capabilities and responsibilities. The great and mighty business of life devolves on men, but a most important portion of the duties of life, especially a private life, falls to the share of women. God has adapted our sex to the particular duties to which we are especially called and for which you are not so well fitted, women, society does best when each sex performs the duties for which it is especially ordained. See, men are developed. We're created so that we need to go out, into the world and build our fortune and change the world and be in politics and business. But women have been created with a nature whereby she's happiest being at home. Once again, perhaps that's true, perhaps not. I'm just saying you should be very careful attributing any type of characteristic to the entire gender. Third, the application of these passages all over we don't know how to apply these passages. So that when you look here, can a woman share a missions conference? You ever had a mission speaker in your missions conference as a church? Is that allowed? Church retreats? Because it's not quite Sunday morning worship, although it runs like it. Can women teach Bible theology to men in seminary? Because that's not a church. Seminary is a parachurch. So does it apply there? What about exegetical theological books written by women? Is it just must be verbal? Can it be written as well? I have read a lot of theological books by women in seminary that did not allow women to teach in the classroom when it's Bible and theology. Anywhere else, it's okay. Can women lead discussion-oriented Bible studies? Can women teach Sunday school classes? Can women teach under the authority of a male leadership? Can women be elders in a church? Can women be deacons in a church? I find this very interesting because if women can be deacons in a church, why can't they be elders? Because the two passages are both male-oriented, right? Elders, 1 Timothy chapter 2, the overseer, elder, the husband of one wife, deacons, husband of one wife. So if you want to be consistent, no deacon should be female. To have one as female and the other is not, you're going to have to find another reason to forbid that. But, and here's the but, there's still a reason to maintain some form of minority. After all of that, this is where I'm going to land. And the reason why is threefold. Adam created before Eve. There's something there I cannot explain away. I've read egalitarian explanations for why Adam being created prior to Eve is not an issue of hierarchical in some form, and the explanations are not strong for me. There is something about Adam eating the fruit, Adam being created first, and it's not until Adam ate the fruit that their eyes were open, not when Eve. And when Jesus comes, he's counter to Adam. So that Adam is the head of one human race, Jesus is the head of the new race. That parallel, you come in authority by the fact that Adam came first, and then Adam names Eve. Now that's the second one that I tried to find a good explanation that would convince me in the other direction, and I didn't find one. So Adam names all the animals. Because he knows their nature, he names them in accordance with their nature, but it is also symbolic of his authority. And you can't get away in the text that Adam, as much as he may know Eve and names her in such a way that is consistent with her nature as one who gives birth, you cannot eliminate authority there. I don't know how. I don't think it's possible. So that this morning is I still hold to some type of submission that's authority driven, and as marriage is, so does the church. And so I have three reasons where I don't flip fully to the egalitarian side. Then where do you want to go from here? Can we draw a conclusion from here? So this is where I fall, and this is where I think personally, not as representative of the church. The woman named Mrs. Lewis Ball, and you look at it and say, well, that's funny. That's a male name. How could she be Mrs.? Well, because she preaches under the name of her husband, and everyone knows that. But she was a huge speaker in the early church in the Southern Baptist. No, I think it's Southern Baptist, but it was in one of the Baptist denominations. And she was so popular that they kept inviting her to preach in churches, in worship services and retreats with male and female. But what she not acknowledged was that under the authority of my husband, under the permission of my husband, she preached. Now there's a whole group of preaching in Southern Baptist churches or Baptist churches before the 1940s or so, which has been eliminated these days because of the fundamentalist movement or takeover that had occurred in the recent decades. But women were allowed to do all the different ministries under the headship of the husband or the senior pastor. So my personal view is that the senior pastor position is reserved for male. All other ministries underneath are open to every woman that demonstrates the capability and is qualified to teach. In fact, in the Bible, you already had Deborah, Old Testament, Priscilla, New Testament, who everyone recognizes having a teaching role in some capacity or leadership role. Why? Because there were not enough men qualified, right? That's what the complementarian says. You can have women in leadership if you don't have enough qualified men. See, what that tells me automatically is both sides don't take it as a black and white absolute. Women can be in leadership if they're qualified. And so for me, if I see somebody who's qualified, and I just listened to a sermon by a woman over the weekend, that just blew me away on how good it was. Geez, if I could preach like that, I have no problems putting her up on the pulpit. Or if I have a topic that I am not proficient in, and there's a woman who knows and has far more experience in that particular topic, hey, I would have no problems putting up theologically. Remember, I'm talking as me as myself, not me as pastor of the church. Then what about eldership? I'm going to compromise here, and then you can push back. I think that elders, when they meet, are too narrow vision because they're all men. I think it would be helpful to have a few female voices, at least, to say, have you thought about this? Or this is what, women don't think quite like you guys on that particular matter. We don't have to call them elders formally ordained. All we can call them is elder consultants. I love the word consultant because it means everything and nothing. So you would have female elder consultants, let's say, I don't know, one from the Chinese side, one from the English side, that comes to the meetings, but they have no voting power. But they have the opportunity to contribute and voice the female voice in that context without violating strong complementarian views. As an elder, we don't really vote anyway. We just talk it out until people agree. And so I think it would be helpful to have female consultants on the elder view. So that's my personal view. As a church, I think it's safe to say we're still searching for that place where both Chinese and English side will be comfortable. I think we're still searching with it. That's it. You're welcome to push back, push away, or make any comment you like. And just take everything I said today as my personal view, not representative, especially the last part. So quiet. The women should be quiet and men don't want to say anything. So this is what happens. Well, I'm not going to force issues, so I'll give 30 more seconds and then.
Just quick.
Yeah.
Do you think when it was written in Corinthians and the evolution of the church, that there was a lot of influence from the Jewish community or the culture at that time?
Oh, so thank you for that. It's a great question. Whenever you read these letters, you have to be careful that you're not reading it in light of modern context. It's the context of that time and that particular geographical location. Mm-hmm. So when it's writing to Ephesians versus writing to those who are in Rome, you have to look at the context of the city. If I was writing a letter to a church, I wouldn't write the same letter to New York, Las Vegas, and Texas. Believe me, it won't be read the same way. So that's why you spend so much historical research so that you can understand the context. Now, for Ephesians, we're lucky because Acts has an entire chapter on the cultural context of Ephesus. And we know that there's strong worship of Artemis, temple worship, to the point where, 18,000 silver shekels, whatever worth the material was brought on witchcraft and all of that and burnt in the city. That's why the letter has so much emphasis on power, because of the cultural context. So you cannot eliminate it from the particular culture. And First Corinthians as well, a number are arguing that it's a cultural context, and then 2 Timothy 2 has a cultural context that's embedded within it. And Ephesians would be the female submit. That's how the egalitarian side wants to make it geographically local context, so that it doesn't apply all across the board. That's their main strategy. And then the other side is to get the language to be universal, and that's the battle back and forth. And it's a battle that's I don't think it's gonna go away in the near future. And currently, the egalitarian side is increasing in droves, and it's age dependent. Younger you go, the more egalitarian; the older you go, more complementarian. But the big thing is that in the last decade or so, strong complementarian groups have been hit hard with sex abuse charges. And there are some writers who argue submission language leads automatically to abusive language. It can lead that way. I don't think it's automatic. That's why I have the point, you have to be careful. Submission is not abuse. It can open the door in some cases. But yeah, so you have to look at the cultural context. That's a question. Any other? Yes, sir.
So how can being a man, we are in the better position in this context?
Mhm.
How should how could this context related to us?
Right.
Basically, we are fine. Basically, presumably, I'm fine with women elders. What should I do? Nothing. So how can this what is this difference actually meaning to normal?
Yeah, that's a great question too. What's the rubber meets the road application? And so, at least for me personally, from where I stand, the practical application is when the situation is right and there is a woman who can preach from the pulpit under my leadership, that I can invite her to do that. So that's a big practice, but that would be one. And the other one is, even if women aren't elders, they could be women, elder consultants. So my practical is to propose that, which I plan to do at the end of the year, to the other elders and see what they would think about it. And they may agree, they may not, but that would be my practical. On your end, let's just say for argument's sake, you agree with those, then when a woman preaches, you will not walk out the door, which happens quite regularly in some churches, because you, just by staying in the service, you're accepting the preaching. And then eldership or whatever else, you would, in your own way, vocalize favor for it within your community of influence. And so at least those two, I mean, there may be others. And then for husband and wife, I dealt with some of it in the message, the second half, last 10 minutes or so. So you can look there as well. Yes, Pam.
I really like what you said in the sermon about it really being about a healthy relationship,
Right.
as opposed to this, because I feel like what gets obscured in this conversation is what does leadership mean and what does following or submitting mean, and we spend very little time going through what that means and what it, in a practical sense.
Right.
Because from what I've read, when you get down to the applications are the same, either from the complementarian or the egalitarian. It's very similar. So I think in terms of practicalness, it has to do with that. And I've heard men say that they feel such responsibility and such a great weight upon them when they're told that they are the head, and they don't know what to do with that. And then that's true. Like, what does that mean to lead and stuff? So I think, maybe at some point we can delve into what leading and submitting actually means. But,
Sure. Since it's a Sunday school context, I delegated to you. You're welcome to come up.
I'm not allowed to speak. Let me silent.
You're allowed to speak for that they're already being a man, let's face it, the biggest gender disparity is the prison system. And I don't think that's discrimination. I mean, that's because part of male nature is impulse control, you know?
So the number of men in prison.
And I've heard the argument that that's why God has given a gender, because men have to be kept under control. Yeah, seriously, because they're more likely to commit crimes. So that's why they have to listen to a man.
Right. There is the blessings and the curse of
Yes.
That reminds me when my wife and we had one of these debates. We only had two, but one of these debates, and I think I said something like, I'm the man, I wear the pants in the home or something. And she said, you may wear the pants, but I pick out which pants you wear. She's joking partly because literally she picked out what clothes I wore in the beginning of our marriage. But yeah, in the application of male leadership in the family, if my wife objects to something strongly, I never go through. I mean, we talk it out anyway, so I never say we do this. But if we had a particular plan to go and she says no strongly, I don't. I'll give you one quick story and we can end. Applying to this church. So in my last ministry, things didn't go so well, and I had left. They asked me to leave. I had left. And after about 2-3 months after that scenario, and I had been downsized from Moody, so I'm in a very difficult emotional time in my life. And after 2-3 months, I'm thinking, I need to go into ministry. So I started looking, and I found this church. And I started looking without asking her, because I don't want to ask her. So I Googled, and I found this church. I said, wow, it's right near Silver Spring, and all this, it looked like a church that I could go and serve. And so I emailed Elder Ho and said, is the position, are you guys still searching? And he responded and says, yeah, we are searching. You're welcome to apply. And he said, give me a call or I will call you. And so I still remember walking around in our little area talking to Elder Ho, and it wasn't even an interview. It was like, tell me your story. And he was almost therapeutic at that point. He was very soft and gentle when he wants to be. I just have to add that part in. Oh, I'm being recorded? Direct line to heaven. So he told me to send in the CV, and at this point I thought, I gotta tell my wife. I can't send it in without telling her. And so I go and I let her know I'm applying and I want to send in the CV. And she looks at me and says, I don't think it's the right timing. I said, but honey, I want to be in ministry. It's time to get back in it. And she said, no. And then she goes, if they accept you, I won't go with you. I thought, that's putting her foot down. I didn't have a choice. And so I made one of those embarrassing calls to Elder Ho saying, my wife won't let me. And he understood. And then I went off to Lindale, Texas for a 3-month retreat. And then when it was coming to an end, I called my wife and she said, well, you can apply. So I emailed Elder Ho, and he said, I'm sorry, but we're interviewing a candidate. He's Korean. And he's on the congregational vote level. And I think, it's close. And I thought, my initially anger, a little bit, but man, we missed this timing. And then about a week later, Elder Ho emails me and said, this candidate didn't go through. Why don't you submit your name? There's wisdom in listening to your wife and wives to husbands, because if God wants it, it'll work out in the long run. It really will. I'm done.
So very quickly. So I make 3 points. It's 3 questions actually, but very quickly. So I don't understand that if somebody believes that the Bible teaches subordination, of the woman to the man, I still don't understand why it follows the man cannot be senior pastor. Because that doesn't mean that all women are inferior or unqualified, and everybody is in the priesthood, says 1 Peter. So the senior pastor is just leading there to can see what the woman cannot do, even if for some other aspects of discrimination.
Right.
Same thing.
Hey, can we do one at a time? Just real quick.
Sure.
I have no issues if you go the other direction. I mean, I gave my 3 reasons, and I'll keep working on it on my own. But I don't have a problem going to a church where the woman is senior pastor. I don't have a problem listening to sermons by women preachers as well. And my daughter goes to a church whose senior pastor was one of my students. So we visited and we did. But for now, for me personally, I still reserve that senior pastor slot.
I don't think it follows from a general subordination. I don't grant you the subordination, but even if I grant
Right.
it,
Then you and I can talk and maybe you'll convince me.
all right.
Yeah.
That's number one. Number two is that as you show several passages, there's lots of complication, and there are additional, much more complications that are often obscured by traditional interpretation or translations. The things that you said about Adam and Eve in Genesis 2, for example, it's there, but you omit other particulars or details that I think they bear to the discussion. I don't open that door now, but just want to make the point that everything is so much more complicated. Genesis 1:1, there's no subordination, both also the female is in the likeness of God.
I agree.
The letter of Paul, there was probably a two-way communication. We only had one side of the communication. Maybe some letters got pasted into one, some letters into. So and Paul thought that the war was about to end in a few months or years at most. So it was reacting to practical problems in specific community may not have wanted to diverge from what the main message. I think that anyway, in a few months, the universe is apart, the history is gone. And that didn't happen. So we should be very careful, especially when we take something that is oppressive to somebody or potentially engender a slippery slope that ends up in oppression. Should be very careful. And third one is that even if I grant you all this data in the Bible, or I grant you to the subordination camp this data of the Bible, that doesn't mean they are definitive. So
Right.
the way in which I see the Bible is that it tries to teach us that this world is full of unhealthy relation, unhealthy things, and we should try to get the light of Christ and expand it. And it doesn't mean that Paul, if he was a subordinationist, he started this way, but it doesn't mean that he went all the length that the enlightenment, the Christian enlightenment would require. So we should take that as a paradigm of wrestling with the Christian message in an unhealthy world, not just as a definitive statement of orders that we should keep, right?
No, I appreciate the pushback, and I can only say the issues are extremely complex. I didn't deal with all the issues. And I am in the process of studying, and sometimes I change my mind, other times I don't. So I try to keep up to date on the arguments, but as of now, where I am, this is where I feel comfortable. And people can disagree with me on both sides. So Rhea and I can talk more.
Yeah, I'm
obviously.
gonna ask that maybe you could continue the conversation.
Yeah.
So, I guess I just wanna say this. Do you wanna?
Oh.
I don't always see eye to eye with my husband, but I do know that in every one of these topics that we discuss, that is especially controversial,